I want to look at just a couple of other things while we're paying attention to the interface. One of them is the Preferences option. If you're on a Macintosh, this is under the word Dreamweaver. Here on a Windows machine, it's under Edit. You'll choose Preferences. So again, that's Dreamweaver Preferences on a Macintosh. Now, I want you to notice here that there are many different categories in the Preferences dialog in Dreamweaver and many ways that you can customize how Dreamweaver works and even creates code. So, for example, in the old days, we used the B tag and the I tags for bold and italics. Modern standards recommend strong and emphasis to do that instead. There are some reasons why strong and emphasis are more useful tags than bold and italic. They give a little more control to your users about how anything you want to display strongly or anything you want to emphasize is displayed on the page. But if for some reason you really want to keep the bold and italic tags, you can certainly uncheck that. That's just one example of how Dreamweaver really tries to give you a lot of control, even as it tries to recommend and by default set up whatever the best standards are of the moment. Similarly, we saw earlier the accessibility options. If you don't like that dialog coming up every time you insert an image, a form object, or any other media, you can turn them off here in the accessibility attributes. You have some choices about how absolutely positioned elements are controlled. These were called layers in some earlier versions of Dreamweaver. You can control the coloring of different kinds of code, how code is formatted. You can change code hints, which come up as you're writing code and offer assistance as you're creating code. You can specify whether you want Dreamweaver to fix code for you or not. A lot of programmers love this option that you can turn off those automatic fixes, but if you're not as familiar, you may really appreciate that Dreamweaver tries to take care of some things for you behind the scenes. Copy and paste, as you'll see, has 4 different options. When you copy and paste text in from a program like Microsoft Word, for example, you can bring in some very strange code into the program. So as you copy and paste, if you choose Paste Special, you'll get all 4 of these options in a dialog. If you consistently like to use one option, for example, I actually prefer to use the text with just the basic structure, you can make that selection here in Preferences, and that will be the default option if you use Command-C or Control-C to do your pasting. You have a lot of options about how styles are created, whether shorthand is used or not. This is really a place where Dreamweaver excels in giving you control over CSS. You have some options about comparing files, and here's an option we'll look at a lot in the next chapter. You can associate any extension, meaning any type of file, with any program. So, for example, we can associate all of our PSD files with Photoshop to make sure that if we're working with a PSD file, by default, it'll open in Photoshop. You can also change font options. For the purposes of this series, I'm going to change the font for our code view to Arial, just because it's a little easier to read on the screen, and I'm going to make it a little bigger. Let's make it 12 point. So next time I'm in split view, you'll see the code will look a little bigger and should be a little easier for you to read. There are some times that I will use code view, and I think it is helpful to see it in a bigger size. You can change the highlighting options, whether invisible elements are displayed or not. There are a lot of things that you can add, like anchors for jump links, that instead of actually appearing on the screen, you just get this little icon to let you know where it is. If you like those, you can keep them. If you don't, you can turn them off. And there are many other options, such as comments, that you can display on the screen with these invisible elements. It just makes it easier to keep track of things that don't actually show up in a web browser as you're working in the workspace. I'll just quickly go through some of the rest of these. I'll come back to preview in a browser. The site options, you have some options about how your FTP connection is set up, how long it has to be idle before it disconnects, things like that that you might want to change based on your system. Also, the firewall port options are here. If you're working with a firewall, you may need to change that setting. We saw the status bar option as we were looking at the status bar, and finally, the validator. When you validate the code on your page, you can choose against which standard that will be validated. So by default, Dreamweaver tries to validate all code to the HTML 4.0 standard, but if you prefer to use XHTML strict or transitional, which is really the code that Dreamweaver generally generates, you can check this option here. You're just holding yourself to a higher standard when you choose HTML 4.0, and you're more likely to discover any problems that might happen when you view your page in different web browsers. And that's something you should be aware of. Different browsers can display web pages in different ways.